Good morning. Today is the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. The day is devoted to the 10th anniversary of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted by the General Assembly in 2007. So it's the 10th anniversary of this landmark declaration. A special event today at 3 p.m. in the ECOSOC chamber will feature high-level remarks and a brief film screening, and also a panel of experts to discuss the progress and the challenges in realizing the rights of Indigenous peoples. And we have three experts here with us today to provide an overview of where we stand after a decade of the landmark declaration. So the first speaker here is Ms. Mariam Aboubakrine. She's the current chairperson of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. She's a medical doctor from Timbuktu in Mali and a member of the Tin Hinan, a women's association focused on indigenous peoples in Africa, particularly the Tuareg. In the middle, we have Grand Chief Wilton Littlechild. He's a Cree chief and lawyer from Canada. He's a founding member of the Indigenous Initiative for Peace and a former member of Parliament. He also served on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and as a vice president of the Indigenous Parliament of the Americas. And on the far side, we have Chandra Roy Hendrickson, the chief of the Secretariat of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in the Division for Social Policy and Development of the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. So I'll hand it over to our speakers. And by the way, we have interpretation English Channel 1 and French Channel 2. Ms. Aboubakrine, we'll start with you.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Madam. I thank you all who are here to celebrate together with us this International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, as well as the 10th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Permit me to recognize the presence of the Honorable Chief Wilton Littlechild, who is one of the major personalities who has fought for the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples. I will briefly refer to the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. For me, it marks the unity of the Indigenous peoples all over the world. Let us recall that the 9th of August was the first day when the Indigenous peoples of the world got together on the occasion of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations in 1982. 2 years later, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted, at the request of the Indigenous peoples, this International Day. Since then, the 370 million indigenous peoples in the 90 countries of the world, through their respective representatives and delegates, have been able to cooperate to be able to bring their rights to bear and to plead for their rights. This has led to to support for their struggle. And 2 decades after that meeting on the 9th of August, 1982, after negotiations with member states, the delegates reached the document which we are commemorating, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. For us, this document is the universal framework and is enormously important for the survival, the dignity, and the well-being of Indigenous peoples. It is an adaptation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the rights of Indigenous peoples. This year, there will be several ceremonies and events that have already marked the commemoration of the 10th anniversary. At the permanent forum, I know that the head of the Secretariat is here and she will probably refer to this, but a working group was held. Every year we have a meeting of a group of experts on a given issue, and this year it was the role of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for the implementation of the Declaration. There was a precedent in 2009. There was a meeting on the same subject in order to see how the various mechanisms of the United Nations and other bodies participate in the implementation of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to pool together their efforts for the better implementation of the Declaration. Also, during the year, during our annual meeting, we addressed the anniversary of the Declaration, and we devoted half a day of discussion to that issue for the same purpose, to be able to take stock what has been done and what can be improved toward a better implementation of the Declaration. The President of the 71st General Assembly also organized something, and that since we knew that we would have the largest possible number of Indigenous peoples in one place, we took advantage of the gracious offer of the President of the General Assembly to have a high-level forum on the 10th anniversary, and this made it possible for us not only to listen to the chairs of the various UN mechanisms on the rights of Indigenous peoples, but also representatives of social, cultural, and geographic areas of Indigenous peoples. Also, member states expressed their wishes and their efforts and the need for efforts to improve the rights of Indigenous peoples ensured and embodied in the UN Declaration. This is what has been done at the United Nations. I'm also pleased to announce that according to what I hear, there are many preparations underway to commemorate the 10th anniversary, which will be on the 13th of September. The declaration was adopted on the 13th of September 2007. So, but throughout the year, in all continents, and here in the Americas, but also in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, many events are being planned to commemorate the 10th anniversary. And together with this commemoration, we want to take stock of what has been done, and we want to hear about what has not been done. Also, we want to learn from those who are active, to learn as well how they have accomplished what they have accomplished, what has worked well, where have there been obstacles to the progress of the Declaration. All of these issues are on the table as we commemorate the 10th anniversary. Specifically then, there have been various elements in promoting the Declaration. At the international level, we have a formal commitment. States which signed the Declaration, which have expressed their support, and this is the case for in the case of the Indigenous peoples. This is the case in Canada, but I'm sure that Chief Wilton Littlechild, who has been one of the commissioners, will, on Truth and Reconciliation, for which the basic document was the Declaration, will refer to this. But internationally, the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples of 2014 referred or adopted a document which advises United Nations bodies to have a system-wide plan of action. This was submitted last year at the 15th session of the Permanent Forum, which is being distributed. This is progress that has been made. At the national level, in the countries, several states decided that they wanted to amend, that they needed to amend their constitution with regard to Indigenous peoples, and some proposed amendments in general. I will not mention examples, otherwise I would take up more time than I have. But resort is made to the Declaration and to jurisprudence, to all of the cases which have gone before courts, regional, national courts. And I am very pleased to hear that the African Court in 2017, very recently, on the rights of on human rights and rights of peoples, is addressing land disputes, lands which had been in dispute among peoples in Kenya. This is now an instrument which will be used. Also, for states, but also at the international level, the Agenda 2030 offers an opportunity. This is an instrument which complements the Declaration. No state can develop on its own. So differently from the Millennium Goals, which Agenda 2030 refers specifically to Indigenous peoples, and this at the international level offers the opportunity to implement the Declaration. And I will stop here so that we have time to listen to my colleagues, and I will only mention that the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples offers us the opportunity throughout the world to promote the Declaration as well as our human rights in general. And I am pleased to hear that everywhere in the world today, events are commemorating this International Day. Thank you.
Grand Chief.
Han totemtek, nigan kahkeoktetam skadnaa. Aseminam stahigoi imam skuta mahkanot, ei miasek. Mutta tahtas kiego, eu tihtama, kegumo yesuon. Eksna naskamon stai. I just bring you greetings in my language, the Cree language, to acknowledge your presence here on a very important and significant day for several reasons, as was just mentioned by my sister. The fact that we're sitting here honoring the 10th anniversary of the UN Declaration on a very important day as well, historically. Because if you remember, back in 1923 and 1925, when two Indigenous leaders tried to get a voice at the United Nations, Chief Deskahe in 1923, and then Ratana, a spiritual leader from the Maori, they couldn't get into the League of Nations as it was then known. From that time, 1923 to 1977, there was no voice for Indigenous peoples. There was no voice to be heard internationally until 1977, when a second delegation groups went to Geneva again to try and seek a voice. And one of the important early objectives in trying to secure that voice at the United Nations was not to only have a voice, but a permanent place where our voice could be heard at the UN. So an effort was launched to try and establish a permanent place at the United Nations. And we were blessed to be able to establish that permanent place, now called the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. But that journey also in 1977 was to try and get recognition on a set of principles for Indigenous peoples. Indeed, when we went there in 1977, we had already drafted a set of principles. So in 1982, when the working group was established, we offered those 10 principles on which a set of rights could be drafted. So the work actually starts in 1923, then it's quiet to 1977 to 1982, when the work on a declaration started. And the working group meetings, the day that we're honoring now, August 9th, was very important because I remember that day actually when the chairperson asked the delegations, if this is about Indigenous peoples, wouldn't it be important to hear from the Indigenous peoples themselves? And actually that's when we were able to offer our suggestions for positive solutions to the challenges that were facing us globally. But when I reflect back on that journey, because for me now it's 40 years I've been on this journey, when I reflect back and I ask myself, what did we accomplish over these years? And then to narrow it down to the last 10 years, what have we accomplished during this decade of Indigenous effort to seek the recognition not only of our rights as Indigenous peoples, but in many instances still seeking the recognition of Indigenous peoples themselves as human beings. Actually, I also remember the day when we were actually, for the first time, we were recognized as human beings. It was 8 years of debate on whether or not Indigenous peoples are human beings. And it revolved actually around one letter, and it's become kind of historic significance now. And that letter was the letter S, and whether it should be added to the word people. And I remember my elders saying, as I reported to them, well, what are we then if we're not peoples? Are we a herd of elk or moose or animals? What are we? And I said, well, they want to recognize us as societies, as groups, as ethnic minorities, populations. And one of the elders said, I know why. I know why they don't want to recognize us as peoples. He said, if they do, they have to admit we're human beings. And if they admit we're human beings, they have to admit we have human rights. And that was an elder's observation of all our efforts in the international arena to that point. So we're here on a historic day. But when I look back, I also ask, what have we contributed as Indigenous peoples to humankind in this journey? Not only to search and try to seek recognition of us as human beings with human rights, but What have we offered to the world? And a couple of very significant contributions Indigenous peoples made during this history of debate at the UN. The longest debated declaration in UN history, 27 years it took. So I remember, for example, being asked to go to the chairperson to ask if we could open the meeting with a prayer. And to be told, Mr. Littlechild, you know we don't pray at the United Nations. And I said, well, it's not really a prayer, it's an invocation. We offer thanksgiving to Creator for blessing us with another beautiful day like today. And she said, well, how long is that going to take? And I said, I don't know, it's elders that present the honor. So anyway, she agreed. But to make a long story short, the outcome of that was the recognition of spiritual rights, that there's such a thing not only of economic, social, and cultural rights, or civil and political rights, but also spiritual rights. It was our elders that offered that to humankind. So now, actually, every one of our meetings, every day, we start with a prayer at the UN. Then I remember an elder asking a delegation of states, 181, I think, were in the room, delegations. And he asked the delegations, which one of you is going to argue for my brother, the fish? Who among you is going to argue for my brother, the birds that flies? Or the four-leggeds that die so we can live? Who among you is going to argue for clean air and clean water? You could hear a pin drop that day. It was so quiet in the room. But also that day marks the start of a consciousness at the UN about environmental protection. The very thing we're faced with today, the climate change discussions. That started with Indigenous elders raising the issue. In fact, in Rio, when the first summit was held on the environment, it was Indigenous peoples that played a key role. So I think, and I believe that those two important contributions to humankind by our peoples during this journey of seeking recognition for ourselves as humans with human rights was an important contribution. Yes, we accomplished another significant milestone, and that was the recognition of our inherent rights to self-determination. That these are inherent rights that you're born with. Then, of course, the milestone we're marking today, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples itself, the adoption of that. Now, when we look back on that decade, we look to the work of the Permanent Forum, for example, who in their second session already decided at the first session that women's rights should be an ongoing issue, cross-cutting issue. Then the next session, we brought in children's rights. That was Indigenous leadership. Then we brought in persons with disabilities. So now those are ongoing, important aspects of our discussions. Again, an important contribution. And here in the Americas, the notion of Indigenous family was discussed and debated during the debates on the OAS Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, where Indigenous family, Indigenous laws are for the first time recognized. But that's not only a benefit to Indigenous peoples, it's a benefit to all peoples, that family is an important central foundation of society. But also the recognition of Indigenous laws, because sometimes, for example, in our songs, laws are carried in our culture. So the milestone that we honor today at home was also a fundamental reason why we actually went to the United Nations. The reason I went to the United Nations in 1977 was because my elders instructed me that they were concerned about treaty violations. Treaties were being breached on a daily basis, they said. Very concerned. So we need to go back to the international arena. After all, our treaty is with Her Majesty Queen Victoria, Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It's an international treaty. So That's why we went. So the outcome of that is we had a 9-year study at the UN on treaties. The late Professor Alfonso Martinez did a study on treaties. So these are historical accomplishments that are culminating now on this 10th year in a very good way. And I'll address later the change that's been happening in my country, in Canada, Gaganata, as we say in my language, the clean land, about implementation of the UN Declaration, how things are changing in a very positive direction in my country in terms of implementation of the UN Declaration. Because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that just concluded its work, as was mentioned, we made 94 calls to action. 16 of those calls to action are on the UN Declaration itself and how to implement the UN Declaration. So we've had these accomplishments, I think, and in recognition. A couple others that we offered to the world was at the World Health Organization. Health, from the Indigenous perspective, is a holistic perspective. That is not only about physical health, but also mental health, cultural health, and very importantly, spiritual health. So these 4 dimensions as a holistic perspective, what we call the medicine wheel, also was an offering to the World Health Organization for the first time to look at Indigenous perspective of health. And of course, the inclusion of food as a part of our ceremony, our feasts that we hold in our communities. At the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, at their World Summit, for the first time heard that food is not only for eating, it's also for spiritual ceremony. So these are Indigenous perspectives we've offered to the world that I think were important milestones that we celebrate today on a 10th anniversary of the UN Declaration, and also to mark the special day when the working group started in Geneva to discuss, are Indigenous peoples actually human beings? Mm-hmm. And do they have rights? And of course now we're here with a loud and clear yes to both of those. So thank you very much for your joining us today in this marking of a very, very important milestone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Chandra?
Hello. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for being here with us. It's a great privilege for me to actually be sitting here with my two chairpersons, with the current chairperson of the forum, Ms. Mariam Aboubakrine. In a way, from what Chief Wilton Littlechild mentioned in terms of how at the forum the work has progressed, in a way I feel that Ms. Aboubakrine embodies that in terms of being a young Indigenous woman, professional, yet a very strong advocate for these rights. Chief Wilton Littlechild, when I first went to the UN, just to give a little bit of a personal perspective on this, I was also among those Indigenous advocates who first joined the UN in Geneva in the 1990s, much, much later. And for us, when we saw Chief Wilton Littlechild and when he speaks, I have seen him continuously for how many years, and he never ceases to amaze and inspire me, because it's something that we always look up to for all the Indigenous advocates and representatives who come. Just to mention a little bit that Chief Wilton Littlechild and Ms. Mariam Aboubakrine have been and were members of the Permanent Forum, and also of the expert mechanism. And I just wanted to round up a little bit to say that in addition to the Permanent Forum, one of the achievements, as the Chief Wilton Littlechild pointed out, is the UN actually took on board with great attention the demands of the indigenous peoples. And in addition to the permanent forum, which was in response to calls for a permanent place at the UN, because earlier the working group that everybody, the indigenous representatives, went to in Geneva was a working group of the subcommission of the commission, which was did not carry as much weight as indigenous peoples wanted it to. And that was why the demands were for the forum to be placed at the level where it is now arose. Now, we also have in the 2002, we also have the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is part of the Special Procedures Mechanism. We then had what we have now is the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, which is in a way following on from the work of the working group. And it has since, as our chairperson mentioned, in 2014, we had the UN organize for the first time a World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. It was a high-level event known as the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. This was served to mobilize attention, because you had in 2014, you had many things happening, yet at the same time there were many developments taking place. And in addition, there were noticeable shifts and changes in how indigenous peoples were being recognized in different countries. For instance, Chief Wilton, Littlechild, referred to Canada as also changing their position. And this, in a way, is significant because you had 4 countries that voted against the adoption of the declaration in 2007. Yet all 4 have changed their positions and now do support the declaration. And this is very significant, signifying, demonstrating that what happens at one given point is not necessarily written in stone, and that there are changes, there are trends. And the reason for these changes, I would like to say, are mainly due to the efforts of the indigenous peoples in those countries themselves, of course with the help of other supporters and others. And this comes back to the point that Chief Littlechild raised. At the UN provides the space, the fora, the opportunity, as was mentioned by the chairperson. Yet the UN also strives to be flexible and responsive, and it is driven by the requests that come in, by the voices that are heard, the demands that are made, the challenges that need to be addressed. And that is why, as we move forward into the next 10 years of the declaration, we do note that there are many challenges that remain. At the UN, at the forum, at the expert mechanism, also with the Special Rapporteur, we continue to hear reports of indigenous peoples' rights that have been violated, indigenous women that are placed under severe stress, violence, hardship, and also in terms of others who are defending their own rights that also do face challenges. And this is where I believe that for the next 10 years of the declaration, as each year we celebrate the International Indigenous Peoples Day, which provides an opportunity for not just at the UN, but as the chairperson pointed out, there are also celebrations more and more in different countries around the world, in Asia, in Africa, here in the US, and in other parts of the world. But as we go into the next decade, next 10 years, I believe that, we still have to continue our efforts, and we still have a lot more that we need to do. And with the new development agenda for 2030, which is in itself an advance in terms that it actually recognizes and particularly references indigenous peoples, which is a step up from the MDGs. And so that in itself came about because indigenous peoples were very much there, raised their voices, lobbied to the member states, and in response, we have in the development agenda for 2030, there are references to indigenous peoples in terms of education, in terms of health. But of course, as Chief Wilton Littlechild pointed out, indigenous peoples' rights are holistic, and they embrace all aspects of culture, spirituality, gender, resource rights. So these are all aspects that have to be taken into account so that in the development agenda for 2030, as we move forward into the next 15 years to 2030, we will be able to take more cognizance, more recognition, more inclusion of Indigenous peoples' rights as outlined in the Declaration.
Okay, the speakers will take a few questions now. Yes.
Thank you very much for this opportunity and congratulations. I'm Waldo from Latin American News Agency. 2 questions. A decade after the adoption of the declaration and 2 years into the implementation of the 2030 agenda, what are the main challenges that Indigenous people still face in order to be fully included? And my second question, last month during the high-level meeting of the ECOSOC, about 40 countries presented voluntary reports on the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And my question is, do you think that Indigenous people are receiving enough attention in this process? Thank you very much.
Who wants to take it? The first question. Mariam?
Yes, those are very, very important questions. First one, in terms of challenges, one of the current challenges that we face, just as I mentioned, we had this journey of recognition, but now we're at a point again where we're being challenged on our right to participate in decision making. Our right to participate in decision making. That's being challenged now in the current discussions on, that was an outcome of the World Conference actually, was to have a recognized participation of Indigenous peoples in the UN system. So now that's being questioned. So that's still, it's kind of a challenge that's coming back for a second round in a sense, where we can't fully, effectively and directly participate in all arenas where our matters are being affected. With regard to the Sustainable Development Goals, I remember when the Millennium Development Goals were passed and adopted, we were excluded. Indeed, the Permanent Forum actually took it upon itself to put an Indigenous lens on the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, questioning how can we make these goals apply to Indigenous peoples. This time, again, I remember in another room in this building, a very late night discussion, like early in the morning discussion happening on whether or not Indigenous peoples can be included. So when I look at those goals, I mean, all of them impact us directly. So we sought to be more directly included in the discussions. For example, to end poverty. Well, we know that poverty impacts Indigenous people sometimes disproportionately in the sense of much greater ways in countries when the populations or the data is revealed that it's Indigenous peoples who are the poorest among some of the states. Whether it's education, whether it's health, these all affect us. And we need to be more fully engaged. We need to be more directly involved. That's still a very big challenge, and I sit here thinking it's really sad and unfortunate that we come back to that question, because that's how we started in 1923, by being ignored and rejected. And then for 40 years now, making some significant steps, but now again we have another wall that we need to climb. So that's a very important ongoing challenge, the right to participate in decision making.
Mariam?
Merci pour...
Thank you very much for your questions, for both of them indeed. I believe that the 2 questions are linked. They address similar subject matter. So I'm simply going to build upon the answer we've already heard from Grand Chief Littlechild. Now, the challenges that I see before us today when it comes to the implementation of the declaration, particularly in the Latin American context, but not just in Latin America, is that of states who are middle-income countries who are on the path to development. And when you talk about development, the elephant in the room is natural resources, it's land ownership. So there's a challenge there for those middle-income countries as they pursue development, not to run roughshod over indigenous people's rights, to ensure that they pursue the principle of free, prior, informed consent, and that they uphold the traditions of indigenous peoples, and to balance that with their development needs. I see that as a major challenge or major difficulty. It's the first one I draw attention to. Next, I turn to your second question, where you alluded to the voluntary reports under the 2030 agenda. Personally speaking, I'm of the view that indigenous peoples are fairly well represented in the 2030 agenda. Our rights, our needs are captured properly in the very preamble. Paragraphs 23, 25, and 52 of said preamble all refer explicitly to indigenous peoples. Goals 2, 3, 4, and 5 also refer to indigenous peoples, and as was flagged by Grand Chief Littlechild previously, the issue of the participation of indigenous peoples is a major challenge, generally speaking, and in the 2030 agenda. But on this point, paragraph 79 refers to participation of indigenous peoples. That's paragraph 29 of the 2030 agenda. Governments, the private sector, indigenous peoples themselves, the United Nations organizations can use this as a framework to see indigenous peoples as harbingers of development rather than burdens, therefore. I think that we need to shift mindsets in that way to understand indigenous peoples as key actors for development, a key section of the world's population who have great potential that can be harnessed across the board for development in fields such as education, or the way in which they preserve and uphold the environment and how they relate with the environment. We can also draw from indigenous peoples in ways, as referred to by Grand Chief Littlechild, when it comes to the treatment of one another and how we address issues such as health. Because in all of these fields, health, education, relationships with our fellow human beings, we have a holistic approach, which is perhaps something lacking in modern health systems, if I think about psychiatric issues, for example. So I think we do represent an opportunity. We should be seen as having development potential, and that needs to be borne in mind. That is perhaps a challenge in terms of change of mindset, so that people do see indigenous peoples in that way, including indigenous peoples themselves. And I think it's encouraging that we were referred to in the 2030 agenda, but now it's a question of turning words into practice. Our profile has been raised, and we need to raise the visibility of the contribution that we can make. And I hope that when we take stock in 2030, we will see very clearly the contribution made by indigenous peoples as part of this agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mauricio Guerrero, Mexican News Agency. There has been an increase in recent years of killings of indigenous rights defenders, specifically in Latin America. Why do you think this is happening? Do you see what are the common factors behind these increases? And my second question, how do you assess the implementation of mechanisms to organize informed consultations in indigenous territories when it comes to create economic projects? Do you see any concrete progress in this front? Thank you very much.
The first question in terms of human rights defenders and the noticeable increase of death of Indigenous human rights defenders is very concerning. Indeed, at the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, they have put forward that topic as one that needs to be looked at in depth. Where are these killings happening? Why are they happening? When are they happening? And you'll note that you've isolated, not isolated, but referenced one region. But it's also, in fact, happening in all the indigenous socio-political regions in the world where human rights defenders, and sadly, in many instances, women, human rights defenders are being killed. Why? Many times it's to protect Mother Earth. It's to protect water. It's to protect land, resources and territories. So when people dare to stand up in defense of their rights, that we in our indigenous world view it a responsibility that we have. It's a responsibility for us to take care of Mother Earth. That seems to present a cause for others to kill, not only the voice, but the person themselves. So it's a very serious concern that you're right, it's escalating in terms of numbers. And I don't want to speak out of turn because I'm no longer a member of the expert mechanism, but I think that they're going to study that particular issue as such as the Permanent Forum is also looking at that situation. We need to get to the reason why this is happening. Sometimes it's private armies that are hired by corporations who want to extract resources in indigenous territories. So we need to look at that situation. And actually there's a solution to that, which is a part of your second question. When you look at the right to free, prior, and informed consent, which is in the Declaration, it's also in the Americas Declaration. Free, prior, and informed consent is seen by some areas, some states, some people, as a right to veto development. And for me, that's a mischaracterization. Free, prior, and informed consent is actually a right to say yes. It's a right to say yes, but it's also a right to be consulted, which is a legal duty already anyway. The right to be consulted or the duty to be consulted. But that's only part of the step. The next step is the right not only to be consulted, but to be consulted for the purpose of obtaining your consent. Now, when you look at that right, corporations, for example, and in some cases governments, don't like to honor that right and will do anything and everything to block it. And that's where you have violence, that's where you have killings happening. So we need to, I think, put a new lens to the duty to consult and the right to free, prior, and informed consent. If I may quickly give an example, in our case, I'm the Grand Chief for Treaty Number 6. Treaty Number 6 was negotiated by my ancestors back in 1876 and 1877. Already in that treaty, the word consent has been written in. So it's not a new, because of the declaration reference to free, prior, and informed consent, it was already incorporated into our treaty 140 years ago. So this year, as Canada celebrates 150-year anniversary, we're also commemorating our 140th year of our treaty, where we agreed to share our territories and resources. So it's not so much a new concept from that perspective. But let's look at free, prior, and informed consent from a positive perspective rather than a negative perspective. Because Indigenous peoples are not all against development. It's under what terms development should occur.
Did you want to comment? Or we go on to the next question? Yes.
Matthew Lee, Inner City Press. Thanks a lot for the briefing. I wanted to ask some kind of just specifically UN questions in terms of participation. I think during the high-level political forum on SDGs, there were some issues about whether Indigenous, groups could ask questions on national reports, whether the questions were pre-screened. That's one thing that I remembered. And then for the upcoming General Assembly, do you see, given everything that you've said about 1923, 1977, is it going to be different this year? What's the trend in terms of in the General Assembly, in terms of Indigenous peoples participating? The final thing I'm thinking is right now there's geographic names. There's a meeting on geographic names. States are contesting what things should be called. Do quote non-states or Indigenous people have any ability to participate in that in terms of their own naming of things? It's sort of an open-ended question about what are the continuing blockages and what work is being done to make sure that you can participate as you should. Thanks.
Well, there's actually, it seems like, what's the expression? You take one step forward and two steps back. In a sense, we've made a one step forward in terms of recognition of Indigenous peoples, and a parallel step in terms of recognition of the right to participate in decision making. But the two steps back are states that still continue to deny the existence of Indigenous peoples in their countries. There's two approaches to that argument. Some say that we're all Indigenous, so there's no problem. Mm-hmm. And others say, well, there are no Indigenous, so there's no problem. So that's kind of the two steps back. So the recognition, the fundamental recognition of who is an Indigenous person is in debate. I think that the declaration and other discussions previous say self-identification is important. States say, no, you can't self-identify. We as states will decide who is an Indigenous person. So that's a very serious situation, because that blocks the participation. When states can continue to define or demand to define who an Indigenous person is, blocks that participation. So it's kind of, we're coming back to 1923 in a way. And that's why I say it's sad, because we should have gotten beyond that. So the situation where states are demanding that they will decide who an Indigenous person is still a very important challenge, because it's been well accepted already that self-identification is an important criteria for participation. And when a committee is proposed to be established to be the screening body of who can participate, at what level of the UN system, is also a serious challenge, because we need to be at that table deciding also, or helping to decide, who is an Indigenous participant, recognized participant from their territory, for example. And that's linked again to I suppose it's a power struggle in a way. Well, it is, let's put it that way, it is. the power to determine on who is Indigenous and who isn't. And on what criteria do you determine who's Indigenous and who isn't? So those are challenges right now, because there seems to be a fear of recognizing Indigenous peoples with the full right to participate in decision making at all levels of the UN system. Because when they say, well, you could participate at the permanent forum, you could participate at the expert mechanism, isn't that enough? Mm-hmm. Well, we want to participate at the General Assembly, for example. We want to participate at ECOSOC or the Human Rights Council, for example. Actually, I dare say that we want to participate at the, one time, I remember one time we were able to speak to the Security Council, for example. We need to be able to participate at the highest levels of the UN system for ourselves directly, representing ourselves directly. And those are the challenges. You can participate at these levels, but not at this level. And if we recognize you participate at this level, we will determine who can speak at that level. So that's the ongoing challenge.
I am afraid we do have to end because the noon briefing is starting in a few minutes. But thank you very much. Thank you.